So the second strategy is a pathos. This pathos, as you see, is the ability to convince based on the audience's emotions, sympathies, and prejudices. We sometimes try to use the people's emotions to do something, like based on, for example, what they believe in. Based on our understanding of, let's say, the audience, we can, let's say, use the language to arouse, to create certain feelings, certain emotions in people, let's say, to convince them to do something, to convince them, let's say, to believe in something. Normally, this, let's say, convincing, this persuading them is achieved, let's say, through creating, let's say, shared emotional experiences with them. So, why do I say sharing, let's say, some common experiences with them, creating, let's say, shared experiences with them, because that will cause them to, let's say, have some certain feelings. So a good speaker is able, using this pathos strategy to arouse the, let's say, expected feelings in people by using, let's say, again, the appropriate language. And finally, we have the logos, which is the ability to convince the audience based on logic, based on reasons and facts. Sometimes we bring some evidence, we bring some facts, and we logically prove that something is true. We logically convince the people to accept something. The arguments must be appropriate to the audience. This is so important. Like, for example, the research paper, like we talked about the appropriate language to be used. Sometimes we're writing something for example, children. So the language that has to be used for children is totally different from the language that has to be used for adults. Again, the language that has to be used, for example, for literates is different from that of, for example, the language used for illiterates. So it's so important to be able to identify the audience, let's say, and then to decide what sort of language, what type of language is most appropriate to be used for them. So which strategy to be used in a persuasive speech normally depends on, let's say, the audience. We have to identify the audience, and we have to know, for example, which strategy, let's say, would benefit us the most, would, let's say, enable us to be more persuasive, let's say, in convincing them. Like, for example, sometimes you think people have this very strong belief in something, so it's not very easy to use logos to convince them. Probably you will have to, let's say, go for pathos to deal with their emotions, because that is how you could probably be able to, let's say, convince them. So as I said, which strategy to be used is based on, let's say, your understanding of the audience. So accordingly, you will apply one of these strategies to convince them. Well, there are different steps for a persuasive speech. First, determine the purpose of the speech. By this we mean you will have to decide what exactly you're going to achieve, let's say, at the end of the speech. Are you going to, let's say, get them to accept something? Are you going to, let's say, persuade them to, let's say, change their belief about something? Are you expecting them finally, for example, to take an action or probably to stop doing something? So you will have to specify what exactly your purpose of the speech is. This is the first step, because then a lot of other, let's say, things that you will do later depend on, this purpose. So accordingly, you will decide about the other steps. So you will also choose the topic. Like the topic of, for example, an essay should be, let's say, appropriate. By appropriate, we say it cannot be, let's say, too broad or too specific. So it has to be something appropriate. You will have to analyze the audience. This is something that I explained. This is so important because it is the characteristics of all the audience that determines which, let's say, strategy you will apply to convince them. You will have to search for appropriate information and evidence. It is sometimes the evidence, it is sometimes the quotations, it is sometimes the information, besides, for example, the type of language that you use, besides, for example, the strategy that you use that can, let's say, help with your, let's say, persuading the audience. Visual aids as another step could help it's not a must. We say if necessary, you'd better or you should, let's say, prepare some visual aids. Visual aids always help with, let's say, a presentation, because the thing is, for some people, it's so important for them to see something to accept it. I mean, you will talk to them, no matter how much they hear, no matter how much you talk to them. Once you show them something like, for example, a picture or any visual aid, that could help, let's say, them understand the things, that can help, let's say, to accept or agree with something. So visual aids are always helpful. We say if necessary, you'd better provide also visual aids. And finally, the final step after doing all these things, like doing all these steps that are prior to presenting the speech, we have the organization of your speech. And in the following slide, we're going to talk about how to organize a speech and different parts of a speech.